Okay, everybody, it's that time. This is our panel today, and to introduce our panel, I'd like to turn it over to Jon Murchison, CEO, founder of Blackpoint Cyber.
Excellent. Thanks, Ryan. First off, I want to thank everyone still online with us for sticking through all these sessions. I'm really excited for the group of folks we brought together for our panel on cybersecurity and resilience and kind of bigger picture topics. So I'd like to introduce first off Brian Dykstra. He's the CEO of Atlantic Data Forensics, who I'm sure most of you just listened to in the last session. We also have Dr. Ron Clark, close friend, advisor to us, and Ron had a fantastic government career. Ron was a retired Force Recon Marine. He served under President Bush and Obama on the National Security Council, and also was the deputy of NPPD. Read that as a lot of critical infrastructure for the United States at the Department of Homeland Security. And last but not least, very happy that Chris Inglis has joined us. Chris is our former deputy director of the National Security Agency, the highest ranking civilian position, the DoD element. And so, yeah, let's get this going. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, I'll be moderating the panel discussion here. We are going to open this up to questions at the end. So if you have a question, go ahead and post it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen there. Hi, everybody. How are you?
Doing great. Thanks, Ryan.
We're good.
So, excellent. Well, thank you guys all for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I've got some questions that we submitted out to our clients and customers before the event that we put together. So some of them are pretty involved. So I'll be reading some of these off to you guys. The first question is posed to Jon and Brian Dykstra. The question was, since the great digital migration home, what are the single biggest side effects on IT operations that you've observed?
Brian, do you want me to take the first stab, or do you want to go for it?
No, you go ahead.
All right. So I would say, from what we're seeing, obviously we work with hundreds of MSPs, and the first thing I noticed is I was surprised how many companies out there have folks working on tower-style PCs, where when they had to move home, there actually wasn't a work laptop to bring home. So I'd say one of the big side effects we've seen is a lot of folks are stepping many times into already infected computers that they're now trying to hook up through VPN access or whatever and connect to their corporate networks. That was one it makes sense when you think about it, but I didn't think about it. I would think so that's been a big one. Obviously, we've seen a huge push in demand and spike in kind of remote VPN type access to a lot of traditional corporate infrastructures. I think we've also seen, I know we've experienced it, we're a cloud hosted platform. Some of the MSPs, or not MSPs, the IT service providers and internet service providers, what I'm really trying to say, there was a shift in traffic patterns they weren't prepared for. So we saw a lot of sites hosted by GoDaddy have a lot of performance issues. They eventually got a handle on that, and it's gotten a lot better. But, it's just a big merge and push in traffic, remote access, and I'm sure we'll talk later. There's obviously some evolving tactics the bad guys have been using to target folks at home.
Yeah, we saw similar things up to and including companies actually sending home tower and desktop PCs with employees, just going, here, take the monitor, box all this stuff up, take it home and hook it up, which of course doesn't necessarily work. Not everybody knows how to do that necessarily very well. Then they're trying to get them onto VPNs, things like this. I talked to a client last week, very, very large law firm, global law firm, and their VPN was actually collapsing under the weight of having all their employees who weren't normally remote on the VPN. And so they actually had to send out, notices saying, look, unless you're the following tier of people, you just forget about it. We're paying you anyway. Stay home. We'll call you if we need you, but don't log on to the VPN. We'll deal with it ourselves because they just couldn't handle the volume. And then, of course, as Jon alluded to, there's just been a rash of, new, viruses and things like this, ransomware particularly making its way, onto corporate networks from, now new unknown home source and things like this. Now, on the upside, I have seen some companies respond really well with their IT and IT security departments actually going, you know what, we'll buy the extra licenses from the security vendors and we'll push our security stack out to home users' machines and things like this. So, effectively sort of upgrading the home user experience. And then a lot of folks, their home user bandwidth isn't that good. So they can't participate in the, 17-way chats and things like this. It's just, it's too much video and things like this for them. So there's just some of that.
Brian, to follow on, I wonder, in MSPs, you can comment in the questions, how many MSPs have had the talk of split tunnel VPN versus full tunnel? Are we sending all of our traffic, including all the YouTube browsing through the corporate, VPN, or bifurcating it?
They're still trying to talk to people about how to get on a VPN, what a VPN is, this, here's how you use Zoom, things like this. You got to turn your microphone on, things like that. So I don't think anybody's that far along to split tunneling and stuff yet. It'll take a bit.
So follow up kind of to that question, and want to make sure Chris and Ron, if you have any comments, just shout them out. But how have the ways hackers targeted home users evolved from targeting users at work? Now, obviously everyone's at home, so their strategies changed.
Yeah, I'll tackle that. Oh, sorry, Chris, please go ahead.
You go first.
Yeah, I was going to say, when it comes to at-home targeting, from a technical standpoint, we haven't seen a lot actually change from the tradecraft. But what we have seen is, when you break into a corporate network, many times it's like you get in, however, RDP open to the internet. We see that it's like 80% of the ransomware events are caused from that. We'll also see, folks just try and get into a corporate network. They steal domain admin creds and then they spread, right? When you move home, that spread through a VPN, hit the corporate network, go through the VPN, totally doable, but it's fraught with some technical intricacies that can be challenging to overcome. So I think what we see this with every major news event or natural disaster event, is the kind of targeted spear phishing or phishing on content that is, interesting. When you have a whole population is waiting with bated breath for new info and you come up with some clever hook, it's just a way to get your malicious link or whatever in front of someone. So I think what we've seen is a big uptick in kind of email-based delivery, which is always going on anyway. I just think, there's more of that because that's how you have to get in. It changes a little bit.
Yeah, this is Chris. I was just going to add to that back to your first question, I think what some companies are observing, particularly those companies that are large enterprises, and they've tried to perhaps reserve bandwidth for official purposes. Those that have had imposed restrictions, one in particular that I'm thinking of, which said you can use YouTube, but everything else that's not directly business related, you can't do that anymore. Twitter, kind of various news feeds and the like, they had a 40x reduction in the bandwidth that was being consumed on the corporate estate, which means that there are many companies, as they kind of move to a different footing, really haven't done their homework in terms of how the bandwidth is already being used. And so they have some learning over their shoulder to do before they figure out how to create and use the new estate. To Jon's point about what we're seeing in terms of the threats, it's the same old tools that are being used by adversaries. But I saw one credible account last week that said that the application of those tools is up about 400 or 500%. Right, it's game on in terms of folks out there who are up to no good, whether they're simply hacktivists or dedicated criminals, essentially trying to go after this last tactical mile, which for the most part is outside of formal corporate estates. Most users are worried, of course, first and foremost about availability. They just want to get to work now over a virtual connection, less so about confidentiality or the defense of kind of privacy for the data elements that they might be pushing back and forth. And very few users, let alone the CISOs who are trying to get their arms around all of this, have thought their way through the integrity issues or the influence operations that are being mounted on a pretty dramatic scale. All of that means that we have to actually think our way forward about what the new governance would be, what the work streams would be, how do we affect collaboration between folks that don't know how to collaborate, let alone outside of an office, and then bring to bear all of those things that kind of upgrade the IT. The last thing that I would add to this, and this is from an academic experience that I've got. Many of you may know I teach at the Naval Academy. I'm a graduate of the Air Force Academy, and I'll just use the Air Force Academy as a tragic example. The institution was so aggressive in trying to figure out how do they defend medically the kids that were out there at the Air Force Academy, and then kind of spreading them out, that they forgot about the fact that these are still social animals. They still need contact with one another. The mentoring, the connectivity between people, literally between people, is something you cannot forget, even as you try to figure out how do you virtualize all of these connections that used to be face-to-face or done through physical proximity. They had 2 suicides at the Air Force Academy in the first week where they distanced all these kids. It's not the kind of direct fault of anyone, but it indicates that as you're aggressively trying to treat the medical pieces of this, as you're aggressively trying to treat the IT that then is reconstituted, you also can't forget the mentoring, the connectivity, the checking in with people on a daily basis just to make sure that they're okay. Because I think that the generation that's grown up in the midst of this digital technology is used to the kind of integration that we can see over our shoulder. Nobody's prepared for what actually we've done in the last 2-3 weeks.
Wow. Comments, guys?
John, one thought, to echo what you and Chris have sort of already articulated, obviously there's a dramatic increase in that attack surface. There's a dramatic expansion of that last tactical mile. But I think it also exposes sort of how we think about critical infrastructure. For a long time, if you ask most Americans sort of what's critical infrastructure, most of them can't rattle off this sort of arcane 16 critical infrastructure sectors that as DHS kind of parts out the world. But some would sort of say, would probably mostly likely answer a nuclear power plant. Yeah, that's critical infrastructure. The defense industrial base with the joint strike fighters being produced. Yeah, that's critical infrastructure. What about your laptop at home? What about the computer? What about the fiber optic line? What about the cell phone towers? I think this is sort of a moment where, obviously folks here, folks on this panel, folks, our colleagues out sort of watching, you've known this for a long time. This is the central critical infrastructure of the United States. If we think about the economic impact that's occurring today, when I talk to friends of mine, whether they're at a large bank or a large law firm, universally, they'll all say that 10 years ago, they would not have been able, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Wilmer Hale, they would not have been able to operate in a just aggregated environment the way they are currently today. But the criticality of that is so dramatic. Even when you think about keeping our first responders going, keeping our hospitals going, keeping our frontline workers going, from grocery store workers to the truckers, those folks that are keeping us fed and keeping grocery stocks stored up. Then when you even think as well about just, to Chris's point about this, physical distancing doesn't necessarily mean social distancing. If you sort of follow that line of thinking, and they're allowing families to stay connected. John, I've been working with Rutgers on their pandemic response task force where I teach. And one of the things we've been pushing for, especially as we move into holiday season. So, Passover starts today, Easter, Seder, then Ramadan starts very shortly after that. April's a very large month for some of the 3 largest religions in the world. There's going to be things that are really going to challenge the need to maintain that physical distancing. But because of this architecture, because of what all these vendors and MSPs are doing and the security providers tied to it, we're actually allowing families to be connected. If you think about this pandemic, roll it back 10 years, it would have even a more dramatic impact, I think, on our global GDP. And then even in the fight for the pandemic, one of the things that really has advanced our ability to assess the most viable therapeutic treatments, that goes right back to IBM, the supercomputer, right? So 70,000 potential viable treatment options, that does its thing. 6 hours later, it spits out, hey, here are the top 70 that researchers should assess and evaluate sort of in the lab. Or you jump to Singapore where they're actively developing, fielding, and testing, an application that ties to smartphones to help them contact trace, to identify symptoms, to do contact trace. There's some complexities associated with it, but all of this infrastructure is enabling sort of a global response that wouldn't have been possible previously.
Yeah, Ron, to echo your point, I mean, and I couldn't agree more. When you look at for the businesses that can operate, right, remotely and virtually, I mean, there are some that just, it doesn't work well, right? Restaurants with in-person seating, you know, retail, that type of brick and mortar type stuff. I feel so bad for those folks. It's a very challenging time for them. But when we look at the companies that can operate remotely, I mean, our frontline folks are actually, it's the MSPs, it's the IT folks, and the IT folks that work for the larger companies that maybe aren't an MSP. I mean, that is the lifeblood. Without that, like, you quickly realize, we all know, you know, I asked a bunch of people, and I've been asked this as well, would you rather go without electricity or without internet connectivity? You know, I already know my answer. It's like, I'd rather have the internet. I'll get a generator or something. But, you know, so, you know, to put it in a bigger context, like, that work that the IT folks and professionals out there are doing to keep companies up and running, keep continuity of operations, keep it secure, that is the definition today of critical infrastructure. It's absolutely imperative, especially economically.
Yeah, John, you're absolutely right. And it really sort of challenges our traditional paradigm of first responders. And I think already we've had a broadening of what we think of as traditional first responders, you know, from fire and police to fire, police, and our medical professionals. And really very quickly, it's fire, police, medical professionals, and our IT professionals, right, that facilitate and keep this infrastructure going. And especially at a time where, you know, as Chris noted, you know, with a 4 to 5% increase in attacks, just as when we're most reliant upon it, most dependent upon it, the number of attacks are increasing exponentially. And the consequences are much higher. You shut down a hospital today that's actively treating COVID-19 patients, and it would have, you know, the life and death.
Yeah, so if I could add, you know, I think John's right. There are some businesses that naturally can transition to this brave new world where their work can be done virtually, or can achieve some degree of business execution when people are physically kind of spread out. But for those that are in that happy place, that more fortunate place, not all of them have transitioned well. And in my view, the ones that have transitioned the best are the ones that long ago invested for purposes of business transformation, for purposes of efficiency, to a very agile footing where they did at least 4 things. They moved themselves to where the data that they accessed and the applications they accessed were largely in the cloud. You know, oftentimes they did that for cost savings. That's a kind of a fantasy, but they got efficiency and agility from that. 2, they modified their supply chain such that they could have confidence from alpha to omega in supply chains that were spread across the world, and therefore had to figure out, how do you achieve provenance and bona fides when you don't physically have access to the material on site, on premise? 3, they invested in identification and authentication that could essentially handle, right, that spread across that domain. And 4, they invested in analytics such that in a very dynamic situation, when you don't have confidence that you have a stable kind of architecture, you can at least understand moment by moment how it's being used, how it's being employed. You can see things on the rise that perhaps are anomalous in the context of themselves, and address and deal with that. Companies who have not done that, who essentially invested in very stable architectures, have not had the agility necessary to move as quickly as we've had to over the last 3-4 weeks. And they're struggling to figure out, how do you do all of those things in one fell swoop? That's really tough to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of goes back to the whole disruption thing too, with having different businesses disrupted, and now they're almost, you know, this is kind of forcing disruption on a lot of them as well. So this question's a little more.
There's actually, as a couple of good friends of mine are partners at Morgan Stanley, and I think, you know, some of these large institutions that have done the 4 things that Chris outlined that are operating well in this environment, they're going to go back and they're already starting to assess their real estate portfolio. You know, why are we maintaining this really expensive, complex infrastructure if we are actually able to operate in a disaggregated environment? Which I think for, you know, many sort of within this conference, it's an extraordinary sort of transition point and opportunity.
Yeah. So this next question's a little. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
No, I said I had that very same discussion with 2 banking clients this past week, that we're both looking at, maybe we don't need our brick and mortar operations anymore. Maybe we're doing just as much business without it. We could get by with ATMs and, you know, a quarter or less of the tellers that we would have right now.
That's a good point. All right, so this next question is a little more involved. So I'm going to read it because I want to make sure I get it right. I thought it was a really good question. So diving in as it relates to the U.S. government and to the greater extent, the West's reliance on supply chains, specifically from China, it seems we're relying on their products, generic medicines, networking and computer hardware, mobile devices. From a national security standpoint, it seems like the problems highlighted, unfortunately, by our current crisis. How did we get here, right? What are the thoughts on how big of an issue it is for the United States over the coming decades? And if you agree it is a problem, what can we do to solve this?
I'll take a run at that. Of course, we got there because there are folks who've gotten kind of their livelihood, their PhDs in what's called just-in-time, logistics, which is that we don't have warehouses anymore. We don't have reserves or slack in the system. We have these analytics that determine when something's going to wear out. Just ahead of when it does, we give an order to a factory to begin to produce that. And lo and behold, the thing is produced and shipped and delivered just at the moment that whatever it was it replaced wore out. You get enormous efficiency from that, and you get greatly reduced cost, but the system has to work perfectly, right? If you get a single cog or a grain of sand in the machine, it halts, and all of a sudden, that whole stream from start to finish is dead in the water. We're going to have to figure out how to put some slack, surge back in the system, maybe get warehouses again. Kind of have maybe a stockpile of N95 masks just in case, despite the fact that that's not efficient, it will be effective. We're going to have to figure out for those things that we can't depend upon a global supply chain where they're so critical that we need to perhaps make an investment and bring those back on shore. Medical supplies is something you can kind of hear the wonks working their way through. Which of these generics do we need to perhaps produce on shore so that we have ready access to them and nobody can ever hold us hostage? But we also need to think through the IT components as well, right? If we're going to be in a competition with the Chinese that may border on conflict at some point in the future, do we really want some of the critical systems that Ron kind of spoke of earlier, dependent upon a supply chain that says they might hold those away from us? Those are hard calls. If you're going to bring some of that onshore, it's going to be a huge bill to pay. But we're now experiencing the reverse of that bill, which is that you couldn't buy, let alone a roll of toilet paper, you couldn't buy an N95 mask if your life depended upon it. And there are all sorts of other things in a supply chain that are pertinent to even a virtual business that are just really hard to get now for the reasons I think I laid out.
Yeah, Chris, when I take a look at it, China, and Bill Priestap, our former head of counterintelligence for the FBI, is going to cover this tomorrow in his session heavily. But, when you take a big step back and look at how China operates, they're able to do long-term planning. They break it up into 5-year chunks, actually. And when you kind of look at strategically what they're doing, what we're seeing is they're kind of like we did, post-World War II, massive investment in infrastructure, roads, bridges, everything to connect them to Europe. They want to reestablish the Silk Road that they used to have. The other thing they're doing is almost loan sharking, but they're approaching lots of countries, some more authoritarian, that don't have a lot of money, but have great port infrastructure. They're building ports all along. Now let's take a look at IT for a second. Why? They want the building blocks to control trade and distribution, something we've been pros at for a long time. When we look at IT, we have them heavily going after the rare earth mineral market, in fact, almost cornering it, which is key components for military, but also your entire semiconductor business. We used to produce lots of semiconductors and chips and everything in the United States. We don't anymore. You can go to China, and we design this stuff, right? We come up with kind of next gen chipset designs. We ship it over there to get produced. Like, you can consider that IP gone the day you did that. And I'm not even talking about purposeful hacking coming into these corporations and IP theft. So you have a system where you can go there, one-stop shop, get your high-tech product made, packaged, branded, and distributed around the world, right? And then the last step here, which has been a hot potato topic in the UK for sure, is now what's the last step? So it started, they used to produce, let's say, our Cisco equipment. Well, then they, you know, kind of stole a lot of Nortel's info and started making, and others, and started making their own. This is Huawei, right? They make core mobile routing equipment. They make the kind of local loop, so to speak, on the wireless side for some of your 5G towers. And they also make the phone switching equipment and handsets now. So now we're talking about, like, I couldn't think of a worse strategic blunder the West could make in allowing them to control your core IT and internet service provider infrastructure, including mobile, because look at it, we're 100% reliant on it. And I'm not even as worried about the data theft, right? You know, a lot of stuff is encrypted these days. It's not perfect, but it sure makes intercepting stuff over the wire a lot more challenging. But, you know, big picture, you're controlling the raw materials, you're controlling the production, the delivery of data and communications. That to me is a massive strategic blunder we're making. And like, I don't like idealism, but this is one case where I actually think the US, and this has to be government led, needs a moonshot type approach to reestablish our entire high-tech semiconductor production onshore in the United States. However, we got to get the labor to handle that. That's a, you know, we'll have to figure that out. But to me, you know, as we move into this totally connected world, or we're there, right? We're there, right? We're totally reliant, as Chris talked about, just in time. We cannot be held hostage on this equipment and the production of it. That's my opinion on the kind of our reliance on supply chains.
Yeah, John, if I might, I strongly agree with that. I think that there's going to be a very nuanced kind of choice that we have to make inside of that. Our business model in the United States for many years has been, we'll do all the innovation and we'll turn over the commodity production to the rest of the world, right? But if you look at perhaps just within the US Department of Defense at critical systems, probably designed 20, 30 years ago, think about the F-35, how long that's been in development. We were probably on the bleeding edge when we designed all of the systems that are inside of it. But that being 20 years ago, most of what's inside of it now are commodity products. The chips and microprocessors are all offshore because they're no longer interesting to us. We're no longer kind of looking at those as being worthy of something we would apply our best and brightest to. As we bring things back onshore, it can't just be the innovation and the bleeding edge stuff. We need to figure out for what distance, probably tens of years, do we kind of invest in the commodity production, because that stuff is going to populate our critical systems. Last point that I would make is that you mentioned kind of the competition we have with the Chinese, particularly in something like 5G. Huawei comes up as the poster child for that. There's three dimensions of that we need to think our way through. The first is it a fair business proposition? Does our business, does our private sector compete on a level playing field with theirs? The answer is generally no, right? China has invested heavily in subsidizing their businesses in ways that make it tough for ours to essentially achieve kind of a level playing field. Two, what's the quality of the product that they turn up? The Brits have been looking for years for a backdoor, the smoking gun inside of Huawei gear. Turns out that the front doors are so kind of awful, so badly designed, they don't need a backdoor, right? The quality of the IT is somewhere between, you know, mud and bronze. And the third is, you know, what's the legal regime within which not simply the products are built and deployed, but which the operations are managed. And if that legal regime, say the Chinese legal regime, doesn't give the deference to the defense of privacy or civil liberties the way we would, and any company that is headquartered in China therefore has to prostrate themselves at the altar of that legal regime, we're going to rue the day that we allowed our critical services to run on that gear. We're going to have to rethink all three of those questions, not just the primary features that oftentimes kind of rivet our attention, but those things that are according to the business, the economic models, or the resilience and robustness of the IT, and finally the legal regime.
Wow, okay. If you had three basic cybersecurity recommendations that you could apply to businesses and consumers alike, what would those be?
Dykstra, over to you.
I think you just did my three magic things, but
yeah,
it's like you listen to my presentation. Yeah, so my presentation just before this is what I call the three magic things. That over just hundreds of incident responses for those companies where we see a lot less of that, the data breaches. They have three things done, and they're always done, and they're always done completely. If you do them halfway, forget it, it doesn't work. But if you did it completely, it works. One, they've got control of their perimeter. They've got their firewalls up. They've applied all the right security controls and recommendations on those, and they've done it. Every place they have a perimeter access at. Second, you've got antivirus, and it's rolled out everywhere. It's in your email kill chain. It's in your firewalls. It's on all your desktops. It's in your servers. It's in your cloud instances. I am still mystified why people don't think you have to run antivirus on a Windows-based cloud server. I don't know what kind of logic pattern goes on there, but they don't. And then I see ransomware on thousands of cloud servers that could have been avoided. And then finally, 2FA, or multi-factor, whatever you want to call it. Take your pick. And but rolling that out completely, those three things will prevent a guy like me from ever showing up at your office. If they're done wholly and completely, those three simple, sort of generic-y, not really fancy things will solve a lot of your problems.
Good. Brian, I actually have a question.
Absolutely.
Oh, go ahead.
Could I add two more, which takes it from a B+ to an A, which is patch ruthlessly, right? Because most of the things that have bitten companies like WannaCry, not patch, we can argue until the cows come home about whether those vulnerabilities should have been there in the first place, but they were patched, right? And weeks before the damage was suffered.
And the companies that took it the hardest were the ones that were using end-of-life operating systems. That's right. That's poor.
And the last point would be kind of never forget that the front lines of this skirmish, or sometimes this cyber war, the front lines populated by people, and just make sure that you've kind of trained those people to understand what expectations you have of them. What are the common pratfalls? I can't tell you how many times I've been told don't click on a link. I'm still tempted to, right? So tell me again.
Yeah, no, it's odd to me too over the years how often that end user population, the first indication we have an incident going on is because some end user got suspicious and made a call to the help desk. And that's the first indication. All the controls and all this other stuff didn't catch it. It was some end user. It happens over and over.
Absolutely. Hey, Ryan, I got a question for Ron, actually, because I know we're running low on time, if you don't mind. Yep. Ron, you've had a career most people would be extremely envious of already to date, kind of special operations operator. You served in the highest levels of government, working with multiple administrations. You've met with foreign leaders everywhere overseas. A lot of experience in the thick of it during a crisis and preparing for a crisis. How do you see, forget the cyber stuff for a second, how do you see us, the United States, the rest of the world, pragmatic steps to work ourselves out of this? Obviously, we all know a vaccine is going to be a key piece or something to stop it. But how do you kind of see the next, 6-8 months unfolding? I think you have a lot of business owners in attendance today, and sometimes it's easy to get mired in the details of the day-to-day, but it's always important to take a step back and look big picture so you can be informed and prepare. How do you see things unfolding from here out? And how do we get back on track? And what are some, recommendations you have for folks?
Yeah, John. So, I think one of the key building blocks in sort of our pandemic response, as many of you know, currently today there's about 1.4 million confirmed cases globally. That's confirmed cases, and most epidemiologists will assess that it could be a multiple of 5 or 10x greater than that. Those are folks that have taken a COVID-19 test and it's come back decisively positive. You look globally, some of the early tests deployed from WHO, CDC, and others, there's the question of efficacy associated with them, that some of them may be coming back negative because they weren't sort of refined enough, they weren't sensitive enough to pick sort of a low volume of the viral sort of infection. The United States, we're tipping over 400,000. New York is sort of the epicenter of that. What's interesting is from the end of February, when we had our first US citizen pass, 30 days later, we had our 10,000th citizen pass. So as we sort of look at the lethality of this and the mortality, when people talk about R and R naught is the potential viral spread. Basically I'm potentially able to spread to 2.4 people. The reality is that we really don't know, right? Until we actually sort of have enough time and enough data to pull all this together, we won't know. And that really gets to the first point. We have a general frame, right? There's a frame of reference, early R naught work. You looked at US, UK, and China, from anywhere from 1.1 to like 5.6. That's a relatively widespread. One is universal testing. I mean, the reality is, I think the signal to industry and to government needs to be 100% testing of the entire population. If you want to get people back to work, you need a COVID-19 negative test. You need a serological test that demonstrates you've been exposed and potentially have immunity based on the last 100 years of understanding sort of the coronavirus family. And then we need to actively expand our ability and leverage technology to do contact tracing. Right now, it's a very manual process. So first dimension is testing COVID-19 tests universally across the United States. So even when you look at hotspots, you look at the top hotspots today, obviously New York is the epicenter, but they're at like 10x the number of tests that are happening in other places. But you look at the next number two, I think New Jersey sat at like 44,000 this morning. Michigan, Louisiana, Florida, California. California is really interesting in the sense it's a really large state, and their numbers, and they had an early sort of bout of infections, but yet it seems like they've suppressed it. Yet it's unclear how effective their stay-at-home aggressively was. So the question is there a testing issue here? And in many states, and you've heard it over and over again, just watch any report, any channel, there remains this difficulty of getting testing. Obviously, industry has stepped up quickly. Abbott Labs, I think, is a very compelling technology, rapidly test. But even being COVID-19, again, COVID-19 negative, serologically positive. The other challenges I think that we face is that across all 50 states and territories, we don't have universal stay-at-home mandates. And even where you do have stay-at-home mandates, there are different caveats. So 14 of the states that currently either have no mandate or have some mandate, 14 of them have exempted religious gatherings, effectively leaving it over to their parish leaders to assess whether they should hold a large service for Ramadan, Easter, or Passover, right? Sort of delegating that responsibility out of sort of government chains where, and those that have sort of some modicum of guidance is sort of, well, in your church, maintain 6 feet. But we know there was a choir down south, 40 people from the choir practiced social distancing inside a church. They were just doing rehearsal, just 40 of them in a large church, and they spread over the church. On the back end of that, over 50% of them tested positive for COVID-19. And, increasingly we're understanding that the way it spreads, not just through, coughing and sneezing, but really sort of the more things that potentially, and this is where for our frontline workers, first responders, even sort of through your breath, through the sort of respiratory process is a potential pathway, as well as certainly talking, coughing, sneezing. So universal testing, universal stay-at-home mandates, and then it's really the universal mobilization of our national capacity to fight COVID-19. And I think you and Chris hit on something really important, is that the reality is for the last 30 years, we have shipped the vast majority of our critical infrastructure, our manufacturing capability overseas, right? We've largely done that. We innovate, everyone else sort of makes it. And now we're seeing sort of the enormous vulnerability associated with it. And the lever the president had in 1950 for the Defense Production Act is fundamentally different than it has today, right? So when people say, well, we want to make 50,000 ventilators, well, who? Who exactly are you going to task to make 50,000 ventilators that currently has that capacity? And the reality is most of that capacity, whether it's an N95 or N99 mask, it sits in Wuhan, China. And to sort of take a very sort of realistic thing, if we were the first to sort of have a pandemic brew in us, we own the manufacturing base, there is no shortage of masks in China, because naturally they've prioritized their own domestic population, just likely as we would. If we were infected first, it was rampant, we would prioritize our own PPE. And that sort of leads to this next dimension. And John, you and I have talked about this, the universal deployment of personal protective equipment. So our first responders, that's an obvious one, right? Medical professionals, NYPD, I think, had over 2,000 people last night call in for sick. Vast majority of those are COVID-19 positive or have COVID-19-like symptoms. Fortunately, they're a small army, larger than some armies around the world, but that's still a significant hit. We're seeing, significant COVID-19 positive cases in our EMS workers and our doctors, folks in the ER, because they just don't have the personal protective equipment necessary. But then when you go one step away from, the front lines of the front lines, then it's all of our grocery store workers, our truck drivers, they need PPE as well. And the reality right now is we're not able to make a universal policy of definitively saying everyone should wear a mask. Well, recently Surgeon General and others have gradually shifted that guidance. So you and I were talking about this 2 months ago, saying it just makes sense, right? It's common sense. I don't need a sophisticated CDC study to tell me that if you and I are standing each other, put a piece of plastic up between us, you throw a cup of water at me, look, I'm not wet. Of course the barrier system works, but it's a system, right? So it's masks, it's gloves, and then it's also using Clorox and disinfectant on your gloves, right? So if you think about the whole contact trace process, and I think, universal PPE across all citizens. And I think, John, I've sent you some of the 1918 Spanish flu. One of the ditties they used to talk about was obey the law and wear your gauze. Everyone in 1918 understood that wearing a mask was a mitigating measure associated with that. So if it worked 100 years ago and we have better technology today, like what N95 can probably block somewhere between 95, 95.6%, N99, 99%. The size of the coronavirus 19 micron issue is still a challenge associated with the mask. Actually, the mask sort of cellular dimension ranges are a little bit too large for it than what it should be. But I think those four things, universal testing, universal stay-at-home mandates to blunt the curve. And really, when you're flattening the curve, all you're, if you think about what Dr. Fauci says, the virus is going to do what the virus is going to do. Blunting the curve is just so that you don't exceed your medical capacity, so that the mortality, lethality of the virus doesn't exceed your capacity. And that's what you've seen Governor Cuomo, that's what you've seen the governor of New Jersey really fixate on. That's why they're rapidly trying to build out their COVID-19 capability, because when you break that curve, like you've seen in Italy and Spain, and Italy, Spain, France, and Germany all have over 100,000 COVID-19 positive cases. When you break that curve, that's where your mortality dramatically jumps and increases. I think Chris might have had his hand up too.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Ron laid out. That was an excellent kind of discussion of what should happen. Colin Powell used to say, this was largely in association with DoD engagements, but he used to say, whenever you enter into some kind of event, you ought to know the conditions under which you were prepared to leave it. If you put troops in, you need to know what the conditions are that are going to justify pulling them out. That's our challenge right now within the United States is we don't really know what the exit conditions are either. They could be that we've got a vaccine, we've got herd immunity, we've essentially passed the graveyard on this, kind of no pun intended, because it can't hurt us anymore. But we're not in a place where that's going to happen anytime in the next 12 to 18 months if a vaccine comes out, or we do those things in a coherent national way that Ron just described. We're not actually doing those things on a coherent national basis. And so when various and sundry of us in sessions like this, or kind of in a company or so within some small organization say, when can we go out again? We just don't know, right? Because we haven't actually established those exit conditions in some viable way. We have to actually kind of pick that up and get that going in order for us to have confidence that we can leave our houses and re-enter a world where we can achieve some degree of efficiency the way we did, say, more than 3-4 weeks ago. Without that national kind of application and the material kind of production that Ron discussed, I think we're in this for probably at least 6 to 9 months.
Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for your comments and insight. I wanted to take this off the IT topic for a little bit and pull it back since we had the opportunity. We are over time here. We're definitely going to do a replay of this entire conference later on, and maybe in 30 days or so we'll make this session a little bit longer and have you guys, because there's a lot more info I know you guys have. So first off, I want to thank Chris, you, Ron, Brian, I know you guys all serve. So first off, thank you for your service and your continued service. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan. We'll drop off and let the next group of presenters come up. We're going to cover a really cool topic on security where OT meets IT, and specifically on smart properties. So with that, thank you, everybody, and see ya.